The gravel crunched under the tires of my truck as I pulled into my driveway, a sound that usually signaled the beginning of my evening sanctuary. I lived on a 4-acre island of private land, a historical holdover that had never been annexed by the sprawling, meticulously manicured suburban development known as the Glades. My house was a modest, well-maintained rancher built by my grandfather. I paid my county taxes, mowed my grass to a reasonable height, and lived in a state of quiet, blissful independence. But to Karen Holloway, the president of the Glades Homeowners Association, my independence was a personal insult. Karen was a woman who lived for the vision. Her vision involved perfectly uniform mailbox heights, a specific palette of eggshell and sandstone house colors, and the absolute submission of every soul within a 2-mile radius. Because my property sat right at the entrance of her development, she viewed it as her front porch. The fact that I wasn't in her HOA was, to her, a clerical error that she intended to rectify through sheer force of will. The architecture of a vendetta. The harassment began with courtesy notices. Karen would leave bright orange slips on my door, citing me for things like non-conforming shrubbery or unauthorized gravel texture.
At first, I was polite.
I walked over to the HOA office and handed her a copy of my land deed and the county survey maps. "Mrs. Holloway," I said, pointing to the bold red lines on the map. "As you can see, the boundaries of the glades stop 50 feet before my fence line. My property is unincorporated county land. I'm not a member of your association, and I don't plan to be." Karen didn't even look at the maps. She adjusted her glasses and stared at me with a cold, predatory smile. "These records are clearly outdated or improperly filed. The Glades represents the aesthetic standard of this county. If your property is visible from our streets, it is subject to our standards. You're being a hurdle to our property values, and I won't have it." When the notices didn't work, she turned to the whisper campaign. I'd see neighbors, people I'd known for years, suddenly cross the street when they saw me. Karen was telling everyone at the monthly meetings that I was a sovereign citizen extremist, and that my unregulated property was a magnet for crime and vermin. The false color of authority. The tension shifted from bureaucratic to physical on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was in my driveway, checking the oil in my truck, when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up behind me.
2 men stepped out.
They were wearing black tactical vests with secure Glades patches on the chest. They had radios, duty belts, and a practiced, intimidating posture. "You're in violation of Community Security Policy 12B, the larger one said. He didn't have a badge, but he had a look of borrowed authority that made my skin crawl. "We've had reports of suspicious activity on this parcel. You're being detained for questioning by the association board." "You're on private property," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "You have no badge, no warrant, and no right to be here. Get in your car and leave before I call the sheriff." The men didn't leave. Instead, they fanned out, attempting to flank me. This wasn't a talk, it was a tactical enclosure. This is a common intimidation tactic used by those attempting to exert color of authority, a legal term referring to an individual who acts under the guise of legal power they do not actually possess. "We aren't asking," the second one said. He reached into a sheath on his belt and pulled out a 4-inch tactical folding knife. The blade clicked into place with a metallic finality. "Karen says you're a threat to the community. We're here to neutralize that threat."
The confrontation.
I am not a violent man, but I am a man who understands the math of survival. When the second man drew a knife and moved toward my side, and the first man reached for a similar weapon, the situation transitioned from trespass to imminent lethal threat. They moved in tandem, believing that their numbers and their uniforms would cow me into submission. I backed toward the open bed of my truck, keeping my eyes on their hands. "This is your last warning," I said. "There are cameras recording everything you're doing."
They didn't care.
The larger man lunged, the knife aimed at my midsection.
I moved, not away, but into his guard.
It was a frantic, violent struggle on the gravel of my driveway. I managed to redirect his arm, the blade slicing through the air inches from my face. I used the weight of my body to drive him toward the truck, while the second attacker closed in from the left. In the chaos, I managed to gain control of a heavy metal tire iron I'd left on the tailgate. The struggle was brief but brutal. One attacker was incapacitated after a strike to the shoulder that forced him to drop his weapon. The other, the one who had lunged with the knife, sustained a serious injury during the scramble as we hit the ground. I didn't stop until they were both down and disarmed. I stepped back, chest heaving, and saw my neighbors standing on their lawns across the street, phones raised, their faces pale with shock.
The rule of law.
The response from the sheriff's department was massive. Within 10 minutes, the quiet end of the cul-de-sac was a sea of blue and red strobe lights.
I didn't run.
I sat on my porch steps with my hands visible, waiting for the deputies. The two enforcers were loaded into ambulances. One was unconscious, the other was babbling about association rights. I was placed in temporary detention, a standard procedure, but it didn't last long. The investigation was a masterclass in the power of evidence. My home security system had captured the entire incident in 4K resolution.
The footage showed
The trespass, the men entering clearly marked private property. The false authority, their verbal claims of being officers and detaining me. The escalation, both men drawing knives while I was backed against my own vehicle.
the defense, a clear, proportional response to an armed assault.
By midnight, the district attorney ruled the incident a clear case of statutory self-defense. I was released without charges. The conspiracy unravels. The real breakthrough came a week later. One of the attackers, facing 20 years for armed assault and kidnapping, decided he didn't want to be the fall guy for an HOA president. He handed his phone to investigators. The digital trail was a map of Karen Holloway's madness. There were hundreds of emails and encrypted messages. I want him gone by the end of the month. Use whatever pressure is necessary. If he resists, make sure he's too intimidated to ever speak to the sheriff.
He's an outsider.
Nobody will believe him. I'll cover the legal fees from the association discretionary fund. Just get him off that land. Karen was arrested during a Tuesday morning board meeting. The visionary was led out in handcuffs, her sandstone-colored blazer stained with the sweat of a woman who finally realized that bylaws do not trump the United States Constitution.
The aftermath.
The legal fallout was a scorched earth event for the Glades. Karen Holloway, convicted of criminal conspiracy, solicitation of a violent crime, and impersonation facilitation. She was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. The enforcer received 8 years for his role in the assault. The HOA, the organization, collapsed under a series of massive civil lawsuits. The discretionary fund Karen had used to hire the attackers was found to be embezzled from the residents' dues. The board resigned in disgrace, and the HOA was eventually dissolved by a court-appointed receiver. Today, my property is quieter than ever. The Glades is still there, but the enforcement is gone. People wave to me now, not because they're afraid, but because I'm the neighbor who stood his ground when the vision turned into a nightmare. The story of Karen Holloway serves as a permanent reminder to the county: authority is a heavy thing. If you try to wear it without a badge and the law behind you, it will eventually crush you.